Chapter 18. What there was of dawn finally pierced the grimy windows to give shape to the decrepit interior of Billy Bone's shack. It looked even more wretched in the dim light than it had in the dark. Ruth Rose found a pair of gumboots and shook the spiders out of them. Her foot had stopped bleeding. They had wrapped it up in strips of torn bedsheet. It was painful, but she could walk. "What if he's still there?" she said, hobbling towards the door, following Jim. Jim stopped, dopey with sleep. He hadn't really thought about it. Ruth Rose picked up a lawn ornament. "We could flamingo him to death," she said. Jim smiled. It was good to hear her crack a joke. They walked cautiously out to the road. As far as they could tell, there was no car in Jim's yard. It was cold enough that they could see their breath blossoming out of their mouths. They didn't speak, just tried to keep their tired eyes open as best they could, and one foot moving in front of the next. Ruth Rose kept checking behind them. She wasn't armed with a flamingo anymore, but Jim had seen her wrap a rusty kitchen knife in newspaper and shove it down her boot. He hadn't said anything. The sun was lost to them, the palest pencil line of light along the ridge that jutted up from the dark mantle of fir trees to the north of the 12th line. "What do they call that place?" asked Ruth Rose. Jim followed her gaze. "The ridge, you mean?" She nodded. He thought a minute, racked his brain. "I think they call it the ridge," he said. "Sure are imaginative up this way." Jim turned his gaze to the hill. It formed an impressive backdrop to the gouged-out moonscape of Purvis Pool's sandpit. The pit was closed down, had been for years. Jim had never ventured much beyond it. He had played there sometimes when he was younger, the biggest sandbox in the county, leaping off the grassy lip and tumbling down, down, down. He looked at Ruth Rose. Her eyes were fixed on the ridge, the highest point of land in the area. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. She cocked an eyebrow. "Mount Tabor?" He nodded. "Maybe Fisher named it that." "Did the search parties get up that way?" Jim thought a bit. He remembered seeing the police helicopter flying low, but really the police had concentrated the search where they had found the car, down at the southeast corner of the Hawkins farm, and south from there towards the quarry. He stopped in his tracks. "Holy smoke," he said as the truth dawned on him. "What?" "The clues," he said, "the footprints and everything. They all led the search party away from the ridge, the exact opposite direction." Ruth Rose snapped her head in the direction of the high ground. They stood in the middle of the road and watched the light creep over the rim of the ridge and seep like pale lava down the edges into the trees. "Now we're getting somewhere," she said. There were no surprises waiting for them in the farmyard. The Godmobile was gone. Fisher could be hiding, waiting. Somehow Jim didn't think so. Maybe it was the ragged light of day or the prospect of his mother arriving home soon. Whatever the reason, he was willing to take his chances. The back door was hanging open. Jim stepped into the kitchen but stopped on the threshold and gasped. He saw the table on its back, a broken chair lying in the corner. He saw smashed dishes and the torn curtains and red everywhere. Red, primer paint, red. "Father killed Hub." 3 words spray painted like splattered blood on the wall, the floor, the fridge. He held Ruth Rose's hand on his arm. He slapped it away and turned on her, breathing hard, dizzy with rage. Ruth Rose met his gaze, her mouth gaping. "Thought you'd steal his car?" shouted Jim. "What are you talking about?" His arm flung out and pointed behind him to the kitchen. His eyes blazed with betrayal. "Hid in the barn," he shouted, "waited him out?" Her eyes retreated into angry slits. "You think I did this?" He didn't speak. His face said it all. Neither of them moved. Then Ruth Rose stepped into the room and looked around at the ugly lettering, the ugly revelation scrawled everywhere, the empty spray tins, the derangement of what had once been a spotless country kitchen, and she laughed. It was the laughter of a mad person. "Shut up," yelled Jim, his face burning, his neck muscles standing out like cables. "Shut up," he screamed, his voice shattering to 1,000 pieces. "You don't get it, do you?" she spat at him. "Oh, I get it, all right." "No, you don't. You can't. He's brilliant, Jim." "What's that got to do with anything?" She stared at him, shaking her head. Then she scanned the room, looking for something. She marched through the kitchen and into the parlor, barely limping now. Behind the couch, where they'd hidden the night before, she found her sneakers and her jacket. She kicked off Billy Bone's boots. The knife tumbled out of its paper wrapping. She tore off her makeshift bandage, pulled on her shoes, her jacket, and then marched back through the kitchen. Jim grabbed her as she passed. She shook him off. "Oh, sure," she said spitefully, thwacking his hand away. She looked around. "Hey, Jim, you've got to admit, this is a great idea." "You're a lunatic," he shouted. He grabbed at her again, cuffed her, and she cuffed him back. "Come on, Jimbo," she spat. "It's just perfect." She pounded him on the chest with both fists. "Perfect, perfect, perfect." He wanted to kill her, but even wounded, she was way too strong for him. She flung him to the floor, then she fled. He clambered to his feet, took off after her, but as he stepped through the doorway, a rotten apple smashed on the wall beside him. "Thanks for nothing, idiot," she bellowed from the garden. She hurled another apple, which didn't make it as far as the porch. Then she took off through the orchard. She wasn't limping anymore.